go. Um, so yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that, Peter, and thank you to World Universities Network for inviting Leeds to put on a range of webinars over the next few months, and I have the privilege of being first on the rank, so to speak. And to look at, as Peter said, research impact and whether we as individuals, disciplines, universities and countries all really mean the same thing by this term. But before I dive in, I've got a few housekeeping reminders. So there will be a break and there'll also be time for reflection and definitely questions. So please make sure you put them into the chat and identify them with a Q at the beginning so that we can find them easily. We'll also share a recording and all the other materials after the session, including the slides and probably some polls and data from the polls that we'll be asking you to fill in. Please grab something to take notes. You know, we want this to be as interactive as possible, but you know, with it being a webinar and keeping mic and cameras off, that can be a little bit difficult to know that that you're being able to engage. But you know, be an active participant. Take notes, ask questions in the chat. We'll be using, as I said, Microsoft Forms to get your input. So please try to answer each of them. They're all anonymous. You won't be identified. Some of them do ask you to say which country you're in, so that we can see the differences if they play out as a difference that's dependent on countries. And also, please complete the end of session evaluation form, which includes a chance for you to tell us what you're interested in for future sessions. So a bit more about who I am. Well, as most of us, I've got multiple identities, and these are the ones I think are relevant to this session. So back when I was a young man, I did a PhD in a quite fundamental area of physical chemistry that used lasers to investigate combustion. A little bit, there were images like this available pre-internet days of me doing experiments. Actually, this is not doing the experiment. This is being photographed pretending to do the experiment, because no laser light actually shows up like that, not without some intervention. Now, I'd hoped that my PhD, because it was using lasers to investigate combustion situations, I actually really hoped at the time, in the early 90s, that it might be part of the answer to reducing CO2 emissions. Sadly, I was wrong, and I apologize for that. I then worked as a researcher and consultant in the private sector for around 10 years. Now, the different projects I got involved with during that period, if I'd been in an academic context, those projects would have been described as being kind of hopping around disciplines, and actually quite a lot. Then for about the last 20 or so years, I've been a researcher, developer and a coach. And I've been specializing in research impact since 2011, which is around the time that it was confirmed that research impact would be part of the national assessment system within the UK that happened in 2014. So in this session, I'm going to spend some time looking at definitions of research impact, and it reminds me of David Phipps, a Canadian at York University, who I remember back in the day, he was asked about definitions of impact, and he said, please, let's not get into that definitional dystopia. But I think sometimes it's worth having a look at why those definitions alter. And to be honest, in essence, when we look at those words, they usually have negligible difference, and we can be arguing somewhere on the same head of a pin. However, it's how we and the research ecosystems we are in interpret those definitions that can cause huge variability. So it's actually in the practice that the definition may be sparing where the differences lie. Therefore, I'm going to look at biases that may exist in that interpretation. We'll explore those biases by looking at different types of research impact and how they are valued by you, the disciplines you are part of, and the countries you work in. And then going to broaden that out to how different country ecosystems handle research impact, possibly within their assessment practices, within their funding landscapes, and within the university strategies within those different countries. As an aside, I've only had time to, me personally, to explore the countries that are represented by the Worldwide Universities Network. So if you're from a university in the African Research Universities Alliance or the ASEAN Universities Network, please contribute to help me further understand your context. This is about sharing knowledge rather than me sitting in prime position to do that. In fact, I'll be trying to use all your deeper experiences of your countries to benefit all of us. And finally, I wanted to bring this back to what this all means for your research careers and the research strategy that you have or are formulating, which will act as a guide for that career. So hopefully that is what you signed up for. Moving on. So here are 4 different definitions. So 3 of them come from assessment or funding bodies in 3 different countries represented in the Worldwide Universities Network. And 1 comes from a piece of literature that actually, that piece of literature looked at some evaluation mechanisms around research impact. So I'm going to shut up for a second now, so to give you time to read them. And then I'd like you to put in the chat, if you can, things that you notice that are similar and anything you've noticed that's different. So I'll give you a second just to digest those. Okay, I'll see if anything comes into the chat as we're talking. But all of those definitions are focusing on the effects of research outside of academia. So hopefully that's something you noticed. But obviously research has effects within the academy. So this session is going to focus predominantly on the effects outside of academia, but not exclusively. So I'd be really interested in your take on that. Now, fundamentally, all of those definitions can be boiled down to something like this, whether that is inside or outside the academy. It's a noun, which could be a person, a group, an organization, a non-human species, a system, for instance, healthcare or an environmental system. It could be a research discipline or even specific researchers. Now, I've removed the benefit kind of influences that were in those earlier definitions, because that actually, it says there's a positivist bias in actually the defining of those definitions. So I've left it as just changes and effects. Now, these can be interpreted as positive or negative by the specific noun at the beginning of that statement, and the decision on which is driven from their perspective. So if you're part of the noun at the beginning of that statement, you would have, it's your agency to determine whether the change or effect is positive or negative for you. Now, those who set those definitions would normally be thinking in that positivist way. I think in essence, it's just human nature. If I want to have an effect on the world, I want it to be positive. Maybe it doesn't play out for all human beings, but hopefully for the majority. And also a piece of research can have multiple nouns and multiple change sentences. And all of the different people and things represented by those nouns could see the change in effect either way. Impact is therefore really subjective and may therefore require consensus building. Now, for the research impact to be demonstrable, so in essence, can we show it's happened, we would need evidence of the size of the noun, so how big a proportion of the population, if that noun is representing a group, how big a proportion of that population have experienced the effect, and evidence of the size of the effect across that affected population. So therefore, clicks on a blog are not impact, but they may contribute towards understanding that population data for the noun. And actually, I'd argue the same is true of citations. The number doesn't represent the effect. Yes, it counts that it might have had an effect on X number of papers afterwards, but was it positive or negative? It's down to the author of those individual papers to make that choice. Also, just make you think about this. One positive comment is evidence for an effect on one person. So we know if we've got thousands of people that might be in that population, but we only have evidence of an effect for one, really we haven't got beyond just anecdote. So that might change if that one person represented an organization and that organization was large, or that one person was really truly representative of the group and knew of effects within the group. So that's something else that is a challenge with research impact. So ultimately, these specific definitions, the noun change statement of who may experience that change or effect and what those changes and effects are that your research has contributed to, are your specific definitions of research impact, not the generalist definitions we've just looked at. Okay, so I'm going to go quiet for a second again. And in that minute or two, I want you to write down in whatever note-taking, paper, pen, apps, whatever it is, take a minute to write down as many noun and effect statements that you think your research could lead to outside academia, the research you're currently interested in. Okay. Hopefully that's been long enough for you to write down a few thoughts on nouns and effects that your research might lead to. So just moving on. Now, although I've tried to kind of remove that positivist slant in the previous slide, that only works for me in terms of writing those statements. As I've said, it doesn't actually work for those people who are part of that group. So the noun will certainly have a view about whether the change or effect they experiences is positive or negative. And anyone else, any human or organization, etc., who is interested in that system in which the change is happening will have a view too. Therefore, you can't get away from the fact that research impact is inherently subjective. In fact, that kind of holds for almost any judgment, which includes deciding the quality of a particular piece of research, which is why we nearly always have multiple reviewers for publications, grants, promotions. So removing positive inferences addresses my bias and subjectivity, but it doesn't address everyone's. Okay, so let's look at a hypothetical example. Let's assume we were doing some form of research around this water body. So thanks to Peter for reminding us that water is something that that is a can be a fertile ground for research and maybe big problems and big issues with it around the world. So in this particular ecosystem, we're likely to have a wide range of interested parties or entities, the species that live in it or depend on it, the people who live near it or depend on it for their livelihood, those who may regulate what can happen to that water body, either in it or on it. There may be different regulators for those two phases. Those who care about water quality just generally and availability. And you may be able to think of many more. But all of those people, organizations, and species will experience and interpret changes in that water body, which the research may suggest should happen differently. They may have completely different views. Okay, so hopefully the chat is working because we're now at the first of where I'm trying to get your input into things. So hopefully you can see the link to this particular form. If not, you might be able to use the QR code that's displayed. But this form is looking to see what kind of biases we might have. So the first potential bias might be what discipline we're from. So in this one, I'm just asking you to say, what broad area of discipline do you work in? And the next question essentially asks you to rank in importance 7 different broad types of impact. So they're societal, economic, technological, environmental, cultural, health, and political and legal. Now, these categories come from the Research Excellence Framework. I can see we're getting responses. That's great. So I know it's working. These categories come from the Research Excellence Framework, which categorized the reported impacts using a conventional PESTLE analysis that's often used within government policy development, certainly within the UK. But with culture and health pulled out of the societal bucket that PESTLE puts it into. So as I said, what I'm trying to see here is whether there's a difference in ranking for each broad disciplinary area. So I'm going to let that response number creep up. Looks like we've done a good job of trying to attract engineers. Welcome. And health-related researchers. Okay. Still a few more responses to go. Ooh. Health has suddenly jumped. So now that we've got 22 responses so far, it seems to have settled. So I'm going to have a quick look to see how people in those different disciplines rank different types of impact. And pretty unsurprisingly, people in health research tend to put health and well-being at the top. Same for biology, although technology has jumped from bottom to top, I think, between those two disciplines. Nothing in physical sciences, my old home. Engineering researchers, economic, environmental, technological, but health and well-being pushed down a little bit, but still quite close. Computing, economic, cultural, health and well-being still quite high. no law, no business, social sciences. So societal, yeah, again, not surprising. Humanities, societal, cultural. Okay, I think that's fairly obvious. What's about to go into the chat is a summary, so you can look at that in a bit more detail if you'd like to after the session. But essentially, you've demonstrated what the research shows. So here are 4 examples of subjectivity and bias within the literature. So coming back to health researchers in 2018, Gemma Derrick published a book called The Evaluator's Eye, and that monograph describes research she undertook with reviewers of impact case studies before and after the first research excellence framework in the UK in 2014. And she used the 6 units of assessment that make up medicine, health, and life sciences. So essentially, mostly people interested in health-related research. And she found that they had a strong bias towards health and well-being impacts prior to the formal review of the case studies that were submitted in REF. And actually, she noted that some actually didn't call other types of research impact at all. But she did find in her post review interview, so she wasn't allowed to do any ethnographic or sit in on the actual review process. So that's why she did before and after interviews. She found that the rubrics of the assessment exercise had mitigated for that bias. So reviewers had actually managed to identify and score other forms of impact more objectively. So they weren't just scoring health-related impacts highly and everything else much more lowly. Another example from Smith and Stewart in 2017, they suggested there may be a bias in what is actually submitted to an assessment exercise because more significant and far-reaching research impacts are harder to demonstrate with appropriate levels of confidence than smaller, more incremental and potentially earlier stage impacts. And, that's probably fairly true. Think how much harder it is to evaluate the impact of a policy change on huge populations than it is to evaluate the contribution of the research to the actual change of policy. Another study by Chowdhury et al. In 2016 found differences in how research impact were actually scored. So although Gemma Derrick's work found that the rubrics had mitigated in her data set that initial bias, Chowdhury found that actually there were differences. So potentially those disciplinary biases that we've just noticed in the 22 responses in my small piece of work on the slide before, actually were seen in a much bigger study where 363 case studies were analysed, and they found that the differences correlated to the discipline, or in research excellence terminology, the unit of assessment. So unit of assessment roughly correlates to a discipline in which the case studies have been submitted. And then finally, Owensia in 2013 found disciplinary biases in what types of research impact were perceived as desirable or even acceptable. So it goes maybe even a step further than the ranking exercise that we've just done. So all of this indicates that values that underpin an individual's behaviors, a community's behaviors maybe, potentially even a discipline's behaviors across the board, or even at country level, can have a major influence in how research impact is perceived positively, negatively, which are valued, which aren't. So before I move to the next slide, spend a few minutes thinking about why you rank those impacts in the way that you did. What is it about your underpinning values that caused you to rank the top one, the top few, and why the bottom differently? So I'm just going to give you a few minutes to think about that. Okay, so in the next part of the webinar, I'm going to focus on actually research ecosystems within countries. So I'd suggest that they're made up of the assessment practices that may happen in that country, whether there's a national assessment exercise or local assessment exercises. The other influence is likely to be the nature and sources of funding for research in that particular country. And of course, the institutional strategies and individual strategies um, for the people and the organizations that make up that research community in that country. And of course, in all of those three areas, there are still biases and subjectivity. So, for instance, in research assessment, some disciplines prize theoretical work much more highly than other types of research in the same discipline. Another example is some disciplines, such as medical research, really value systematic reviews, whereas this type of work in other disciplines would be seen as lacking originality and hence of lower value and therefore more lowly ranked in terms of research quality. So within this area, what is assessed tends to be valued. And we have the bias in terms of if we see if I'm from a medical discipline and I see a systematic review, I might go, well, that's the best. That's the best of all these things because it's a systematic review compared to a much smaller, maybe pilot exercise that hasn't even got to randomized control trials or things like that. Also, the assessment practices, because this could be at institutional level if there's no national assessment exercise, in those places, in those different institutions, there may be biases about what's perceived as valuable, what's perceived as the most important. So all that really depends on what is actually being assessed and why is that being assessed. So, for instance, in assessment processes, we may be assessing scholarly outputs, we may be assessing societal engagement, such as research impact, we may be assessing bibliometrics, we may be assessing things like research culture, or the performance of organizations, or the performance of individuals. It can really vary in terms of practice. But that can be a huge influence, as I said, on what's valued in those countries. So UK example, obviously I know that best because that's where I've worked for quite a few years now. Our national research assessment process up to 2014 didn't include research impact. And there's a blog post that I posted. You'll see it in the references when you get the slides. But in that blog post, there are academics who said, prior to it being part of the research excellence framework, my academic management used to say to me, stop wasting your time doing that. And then after it was included in the ref in 2014, those same managers, just more senior researchers, moved to saying it's very important. Of course, funders are another huge influence within any country's research ecosystem. So whether funding is dominated by large government-backed schemes, or whether it's from charity or philanthropic funding or even industrial funding, whoever the funder is, they have a responsibility to decide what's important to them and why, and then make decisions informed by those values. So, what types of research will they support and those they won't? So these value decisions then flow down into the assessment criteria they might use for applications in those different types of calls that they might have. So some funders are heavily focused on their funding leading to that change in effect within the world, whilst others may be more focused on supporting a thriving research base, which could be broad-based or disciplinary focused. And of course, finally, your institution and you yourself have influence over what is researched and what is valued. Your institution's strategy and how it invests in the research and impact priorities will shape what research is done and what impact may emerge from that research. You have agency too, as I've said. You decide what research questions are right for you and your skill set and your value set. And that obviously, as we've seen, influences the types of research impact that you prioritise, as we have just seen. Okay, no questions yet in the chat. So if there is anything bubbling away in your brains, please fire away. Or have I moved a few too many? So, in preparing for this session, I spent some time broadening my understanding of those overlapping elements for each country represented by the member institutions of the Worldwide Universities Network. I didn't have time to expand that to the countries represented by Arua and Asin. So apologies if you are working at universities in those member institutions. But this table summarized what I found out. And of course, my interpretation of web pages I might have looked at may not be accurate. And also my search certainly wasn't very extensive. I might have spent maybe 20 to 30 minutes max on any country other than the UK, which I know well. But what I found, is that in general, most countries' big research funders talk about research impact in some way. They might use a different lexicon to describe it. But it is, when I had a look at how they were describing it, it felt to me like research impact. So some of them included it in specific criterias within their various schemes, and some didn't. It was more a kind of a mission, an aspiration. A large number of the member universities of one also mentioned research impact within their institutional strategies or development plans. It was slightly less common to find research impact within assessment practices, but this may mainly be due to some countries not having a national assessment scheme. So a national assessment scheme is easier to find. When it's more local or disciplinary based, it's much harder to see that nuance presented. And thanks to the research on Research Institute, which grew out of work at Sheffield and UCL, led by James Wilsden, because they've just published a tool where you can have a look at different countries' assessment practices and what they focus on. So thanks to Rory for their help with that. We'll also be putting into the chat a document, so hopefully you can download that document that goes into much more detail. So essentially, I've tried to make some notes and then tidy them up afterwards so that they're kind of interpretable by yourself. So if you're interested in finding out what it might look like elsewhere, that might be a useful starting point for you. The big thing I don't know, though, and would never have been able to find out, is how important research impact is to each and every one of you. So before we start thinking about that, let's try and get a better sense of how my findings match or disagree with your lived experiences of those different research ecosystems. So another MS form has gone into the chat. So in this form, there's a first question in terms of which country you're in. If you're not in the World Universities Network, please use the other and then say what country it is. And then the next questions ask you to rate on a Likert scale how important research impact is within research assessment, within research funding, and within your home university. So as I said, if there's no national research assessment process in your country, then describe, use that Likert scale to say, okay, it feels like at my institution it's this important, or in my discipline it's this important. Okay, I've got one response so far, so thank you for that. As I said, the next question after the Likert scales on how important is ranking the the impact types again. And here, what I'm asking you to do is rank them in a sense in how your country's citizens and government would respond to that question. So try and represent their view. Okay, so give it a few more minutes to let us at least get up to the 22 responses we had previously. I think I've got over 50% response rate, so that's kind of good. It looks like we've reached outside of the World Universities Network a lot. God, what time is it in New Zealand? Congratulations to you people managing to, I think, stay up. Is that right? Wonderful. Okay, we're nearly at the point. So um I'm gonna look at a few of the countries that it's 4:41 a.m. in New Zealand. Rachel, you are a star, and I hope I'm keeping you happy at that time in the morning. Um, so we'll have a look at some of the countries I don't know well. Now, because of knowing colleagues working in both Australia and New Zealand, I'm gonna slightly ignore that. But again, we'll provide the summary for you in a second. So we'll just flick through. I'm going to ignore the UK because guess what? Oh, that's interesting. I'd have thought economic might have been top of the tree because of the Labour government's economic missions. So that's kind of interesting there. But we'll move on. Yep, research assessment in Australia. You paused it. It did used to be in your practices, but I'll not spend too much time on Australia Health too. I wonder whether your own disciplinary biases might be playing out. Is that potentially true? Um, mm. So in New Zealand, I thought the performance-based research fund, which had impact in it, had been paused and no decisions had made. So that's interesting. Okay, cultural, right? Ghana, top of the tree, right? Thank you. Yeah, right. And right, health and technology and economy, all fairly, and environment, all fairly equal there. Nothing for Uganda. Yeah. So I think there was Brazil. I don't know where it. Oh, I don't know the Netherlands. So let's have a look at that. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. Okay. So thanks, Rachel. Nice feedback. Good to see that. And thank you from Nurul. I hope I've said that correctly. Um, and I will come back to the question in a sec. So Amira is going to post us again the summary link in the chat, and when we share the slides and things like that, like the recording, what I'll probably try and do is make the spreadsheet available. So if you want to kind of do a bit more, especially as I noticed a lot of responses were around other. Well, if some of those were from similar, the same countries, there might be some analysis that's worth doing. Okay, so thank you for that. So some reflections. So what I'd like you to do is spend some time reflecting on what we've discussed so far, and please don't feel limited to the prompts I've put in the slide here, but the suggestions are: how aligned is the research impact you want to achieve with that which is preferred in your discipline and in your country. So you remember I asked you to put down the nouns and effect statements. Do they map or don't they into those into where you think you've ranked the discipline and also the country? So remember, even though you might not align with the ranking in your particular discipline or country, what really matters about research impact, because it can take a long time and because it's really hard, is that you need to be intrinsically motivated by the impact you want to achieve, rather than trying to fit in with somebody else's view of what is important. And personally, I think that view is widely shared. It's not just mine. So again, that's mentioned in the blog post that I mentioned, which is from Fippin and Rutt, two academics in the UK that have just published a book that is based on some empirical evidence around academic preferences for impact. Also think about whether you're aligned or not. No matter whether you're aligned or not, does that position generate any challenges or enablers? And how might you use those enablers or overcome those challenges? So again, I'm going to take a second and I'll have a read of that question. Okay. So while you carry on reflecting, I'll just answer Nurul's question. So is it common if in research we write the impacts from our various disciplines? For example, if our research is about the representation of social phenomena in social media, and we try to explore various impacts outside of societal impact. Nurul, it's amazing. There was analysis done of the 7-ish thousand case studies that went into Ref 2014, and that analysis was followed up in the Ref 2021, where another 7,000 different impact case studies in those two data sets, so 14,000 in total. And although there can be I'm going to say the word bias, but what I don't mean is bias. Although there can be, a particular type of research is more likely to generate impact in this space, so they published heat maps. It certainly isn't exclusive. In fact, just about every disciplinary area, and in Ref there are about 34 different categories of research across the four main disciplinary panels. So across those 34 categories, just about all of them had all the different types of impact represented. And they were using, when they did that analysis, they used a much finer grain than the, political, cultural, societal. So they actually used a categorization system that I think had something like 60 odd different, so nearly 70 different categories of impact type, and just about all of them were mentioned at some point in every discipline. Because hopefully that answers the question that it isn't the discipline that really guides. It might have an influence, but it isn't such a strong influence that it completely stops different types of impact. So we've now had a chance to explore differences in how different disciplines rank different types of research impact, and how different countries prioritize that research impact in their ecosystems. But let's start looking at your own specific research impact goals. To recap, these are the things, maybe the people, the organizations, the communities, the environments, the systems, etc., that will feel the change or effect that your research could contribute to. So earlier, I asked you to write down some noun effect statements that your research may contribute to. And this started the process of moving on from those very generic research impact definitions that I showed at the beginning of the webinar to hopefully a more specific and much more useful research impact definition, or indeed definitions if you've got multiple noun effect statements. But to try to get a really good one can take time and thought. Think about how much time you spend properly scoping a robust research question, for instance. Here, you need to do something similar. So you may need to get peer feedback on your noun effect statements, just like you do on your research questions, to make them solid. And because a researcher's superpower is asking questions, when you present something to colleagues, they'll nearly always find a question around it to explore that noun effect statement and hopefully make it more robust through that process. So I'm just going to give us an example, and it's an example I use regularly in the impact training and development I do at Leeds, mainly because it's one that's close to my heart, because my wife used to be a head teacher at a school. So, and it was a primary school where children's literacy is important, to get that developing early. So say I was researching that, and I might have a draft early goal that's children's literacy is improved. Now, when we look at that draft goal, there's a whole range of questions that we might have about it. The easiest one is which children. So this could have a location answer, such as simply geography, or it could be in a systemic sense, i.e., are those children within a formal education system or maybe outside of it? Or maybe they move in and out. So within the UK, we have quite a community of travellers, and sometimes they're moving schools regularly, so there can be real starts and stops in their formal education process. It could have a demographic answer. He'll actually say the word properly. So this could be age, gender, ethnicity, etc., etc. So there's a whole plethora of sub-questions which flow from, well, which children do you actually mean? The draft impact goal also has no specification of how much improvement is enough. And neither do we know what the literacy levels were before the intervention that led to that improvement. So, with no way of kind of judging the improvement, the importance, the scale of the impact. So there could be lots of other questions, such as what criteria are we using to judge literacy levels? Who's making those judgments? And are there any biases in those criteria or how they are applied? Now, I tried to write a more robust, but still early stage goal in the middle of this table. So here I've specified which children. It's year 2 children. So in the English school system, they're age 6 to 7, approximately. I've also specified it a bit more by saying that we're only going to be working with 10 schools within Leeds, because I work there. And we are working with those schools. We've chosen them almost an inclusion criteria because they have higher poverty based on a publicly available measure of the number of pupils within that school, those 10 schools, who are eligible for free school meals. So we've looked for schools that have above average compared to the rest of Leeds, rest of schools in Leeds. I've also said what the hoped for improvement is. So in previous cohorts at those 10 schools, we had 40% of the cohort reaching literacy targets that are specified in the English National Curriculum. So we want to move to 100% of this particular cohort that we're working with in comparison to the previous cohorts. And finally, I've indicated I will monitor that we're on track to generate that level of improvement. And there are actually two pieces of monitoring. One is the amount of reading that those children are experiencing outside of school. And the other is regular teacher assessments of their reading within the classroom. So the final column is a much later stage goal, and it's hopefully bigger, demonstrating much more significant impact. And here we're specifying that the hoped for improvement to literacy levels is between 15 and 40 across all schools, no matter which part of the country they're in, whether they're in a deprived area or an affluent area. But I have limited it to England because within the UK, education policy is managed differently in the 4 different countries that make up the United Kingdom. So what I'd like you to do is take a moment, go back to those noun effect statements that you wrote earlier and have a think, just have a reflect on them. Is it more like that draft goal, which actually you could say is really ambitious, because if we don't put any clarification on that draft goal, it's all children, all ages, everywhere, no matter where on the planet they live. So that's really ambitious. So have a think, is it more like that draft goal where it's not very specific and could be interpreted really ambitiously, and really think about how far into the future. So if I was really saying that all children of all ages everywhere will have their literacy levels will have improved as a result of the research I've been doing, how long is that going to take? Probably longer than most of our lifetimes. So just have a think about that for a few seconds. Hey, hopefully you had a chance to think about your noun and effect statements and whether they're really robust and specific or quite draft in their specificity. So what I'd like to do is try and get a sense of what your noun and effect statements look like. So it's unfortunately another MS form. So what I'd like you to do is just kind of say, is it robust like that middle one? I'm kind of claiming that's a good example of a robust and specific noun effect statement. How achievable is it within the next 1 to 3 years, whatever you've written? Does it have clear baselines? And does it have clear outcomes? Ooh, nice. Ooh, you're all good. I should have asked, are they as long as mine as well? Okay, getting slight variations now. Okay, thank you. I'm going to wait a little bit longer just to get as many responses as possible. Okay, if we get one more, I'll start moving on. Okay, you're going to keep me at 14 responses. That's fair. Um, Now, interestingly, robust and specific. Now, normally when I get people to write down some goals without any prior warning of that, they're normally um, pretty unspecific and pretty lacking in detail. Um, so it's interesting that you aren't. So I think that's great. It's great to see that you're spending, that would suggest to me that data that you've spent time really thinking about that. So pat yourselves on the back for that. It's quite a range in terms, at the moment the deliverable within 1 to 3 years is quite a range. Yeah, that's fine. What I'd suggest to those of you who are kind of it's beyond that is what's your stepping stone to that longer term goals? Have a think about that. Those clear baselines and clear outcomes. So if you essentially, if you don't know where you're starting from and you don't know where you're trying to get to, evaluation is really, really, really hard. So you have to do some quite interesting different methodologies maybe to try and investigate that scale of the effect essentially. So let's have a think about that and see if I can provide you with some more pointers. So if, as I've said, if you weren't robust or specific enough, or they can always be improved, spend some time consulting. So you might do that within your institution. There might be colleagues that you can go to who you could give some get some feedback from. There might even be some research impact people in your institution. Once you've got a little bit more refinement, really kind of try and consult with those who are part of the system. And I try to avoid using kind of interested or because it kind of that has biases involved in it. So those who are part of the system, whether they're interested or not, try and consult them, try and get their views, try and see what matters to them and why. So, as I said, remember, it doesn't have to be complex. You can start small with that. Perhaps less senior people in maybe organizations that are part of that system, maybe people you are closer to. And then you kind of do the usual snowballing methodologies in social science where you would increase that consultation exercise. And you might do that for quite some time, actually. So you might keep iterating, you might keep refining until you have the robustness and specificity that you really need. But remember, you still need to really care about that impact. So if the iteration process has kind of taken you off in a different direction, it's maybe saying that those you wanted to work with aren't as interested in and don't value to the same extent the kind of impact that you do. And that can be fun, that's a fundamental values issue, which can throw up all sorts of problems in a collaboration if you were to be working with them. So think deeply about that. If you thought your research impact is many years in the future, those consultations could help you find those stepping stones that I mentioned when we were looking at the slides. So think about that pathway to that big ambitious impact. You may even find that you have knowledge based on your previous research or the previous research of others that you know well that could generate those earlier impacts. So yeah, remember to kind of be equitable and share that knowledge in ways that don't overburden you. Because we, as I said, equitable means to everybody, not just some. Remember to start small again there and to scale. So think back to the children's literacy example, having a reasonably sized case study. of that evidence improvement in literacy within those 10 schools may really influence other schools and teachers and parents and carers to really adopt that practice, which we've demonstrated has an effect. Also, the teachers within those 10 schools are likely to move in terms of their careers. You know, people don't stay at the same school for their entire career. Some do, some move on. So they will be a disseminational effect for your impact. And finally, those consultations, you know, really look to try and emerge baselines and aspirations for improvement that may not be published or just aren't heard, for instance, because of marginalization of certain groups or individuals. But you really need that data to help you track progress and take corrective actions or entirely replan if the outcomes you, and by that I mean all of you that you've consulted, are hoping for and don't emerge as you'd hoped through the actions that you've designed. So that takes us on to impact and embedding it within your research strategy. So let's think about how this could affect your research strategy. But before I dive into that, I wanted to note 4 things about research strategy. The first one applies to strategy of any kind, which is before defining your strategy, you need to be clear about where you're going. What is the outcome that you hope the strategy will deliver? So these outcomes for your research strategy should include both impact within and outside the academy. You know, I'm not saying we have to be just segmenting to look at outside. You know, think about that from both perspectives. And then that means that you need to think and plan with those ends in mind. So, you know, all of the activities that will support and deliver your research strategy, well, you know, the outcomes you're hoping for. Where do we want to end up? Why is that valuable? So we're planning for that end in mind. Now, of course, as I've said, research impact really of any type, whether that's within the academy or outside of it, we really need to have a clear and equitable understanding of what all of those, and I will use the word interested parties within the system, want or don't want when it comes to change. Okay, so all of that needs to be kind of considered. And I'll try and present 3 different ways of doing that, depending on the type of researcher and your practice currently. So these next 3 slides try to build research impact into research strategy from 3 positions. The first one is very much curiosity-led. The second is challenge-led. And the third is a researcher who uses co-productive methods for shaping their research strategy. These suggestions could be applied either to individual projects or the broader strategy. And it's very much an iterative, you know, in that respect, it's very much an iterative program and project management approach. So with this first scenario, a curiosity-led researcher, they might start off with generating some draft research objectives. They might really, you know, might work them up to be quite robust. But before you get too robust and get too far down the line, I'd suggest that you need to start thinking, okay, I've got some research objectives now that I'm 50% happy with, let's say that. Let's try and think what kind of impact could arise from being successful with those research objectives. So think about those, and then we go into the discussion phase. So we might be doing more discussion within the academy to really cement the research objectives. We might be doing some consultation outside the academy to kind of really cement those noun effect statements that we were talking about earlier. And of course, this diagram is kind of written that consultation progress has gone positively. In other words, that we can eventually come, is everybody happy that we've got a robust set of all of these different requirements for the project? or program of work if it's multiple projects through a research strategy. So are we all happy that we should go ahead and design and deliver the project or projects to deliver those research objectives and the noun effect statement or research impact goals, as I sometimes call them? Now, for a challenge-led researcher, the starting point may be to think about the changes and effects you want to see in the world outside. So starting with your own value judgments, what do you want to see change in the world outside of academia? You could then consult initially, as I said, at small scale before increasing the scale as you become surer about the types of impact that you've initially identified are actually shared priorities. So again, we're kind of thinking, this could go off in other directions in that, yeah, no, they're not really priorities. No, not particularly interested. The kind of question there is, have you approached the right people in terms of a reflection question? And if not, who should you approach? And if you have approached the right people, why is it not a priority for them is the next reflection question. You might want to actually explore that with them during the consultation. But let's assume, yes, those are priorities. Okay, to deliver those priorities, this is the contribution of research. And you also have a secondary question. What's the contribution of other things in the system that the research would have to align with, complement, and build on? So you would do that thinking. So you would then design the project or projects. Finally, a co-productive researcher may bring the consultation fully to the beginning of the process. So that's actually convening, in this sense, we might still start small, but we really need to get to quite large scales to be sure before we move on. The scale will depend on lots of things, such as, how big is the population? So in terms of, do we need to get to 10%? Well, if the population's only 10, that's only one person. Yeah, that's fairly negligible. So this can actually lead to defining highly robust and specific research impact priorities and or research objectives actually at the same time. So, in this diagram, I'm not able to show that, but it could happen at the same time. It's potentially more likely that you get the impact priorities if you're talking to people outside of the academy. But if you were talking to both, you would get both. That's natural. So an example, and again, I'll use a water example. So at Leeds, there's a research theme called Water at Leeds, and currently there's about 250, maybe 300 researchers across nearly all of our 7 faculties that align with that theme at Leeds. Now, the theme came into existence in around 2009, and one of the first things they did was undertake a large-scale consultation exercise. And they used that exercise to identify the top 100 research questions related to water in the UK. And that was actually published in a paper in 2010, and it's in the references, Brown et al. Some other researchers from the water theme in 2022 updated that to go for a fully global context. So if you're actually doing water related research anywhere in the world, you might want to have a look at that paper and go, are some of the questions I'm following, do I agree with that priority list or do I disagree? So that's a specific example of kind of really bringing the consultation exercise early. And remember, we've got, in terms of that water theme, there are engineers, there are social scientists, there are health researchers, there's all sorts of people. There's economic researchers too. So, and of course, always the final stage is the decision. Are we all happy? Whoever's been part of that consultation. that the research objectives and the research impact priorities are robust and specific enough for us to plan a coherent and deliverable project or set of projects. So, research impact. So the big and ambitious ones, as I said earlier, can take a huge amount of time, potentially across your whole career. So having a strategy that breaks that down into realistic projects that are milestones along the way and may have embedded impact milestones along the way is quite important. So early projects would deliver some of those early impacts, which later projects might scale the impact because of new findings from more advanced or complementary research questions. And then a third project that might be even later that really delivers that hoped for final destination. In the slides is a link to a case study that was written for Ref 2014 in the UK. And it's an example of that kind of time scale. So the impact took 20 years. So when you look at the research projects that are discussed in the case study, there's 3 big research projects and actually 3 adjacent and complementary PhD projects, all contributing to the underpinning research to enable that big, ambitious impact to generate that cost-effective, safe wastewater reuse to help improve food security. So yeah, complex and lengthy, and all sorts of things can happen across that time scale that can throw you off track, which is why planning is really important, and reflecting on the plan is the most important thing, actually. So I'm going to give you a little bit of time to reflect on whether impact is built into your research practice, and is it fully fleshed out in how you design your research strategy. So is it built into my practice? Some of the points for the reflection: which of the ways in building it in that I might have discussed work for me or don't work for me, and why? What is that really big, ambitious research impact I want to achieve? Maybe in that far distance. And are the projects I'm thinking of really stepping stones to that really big and ambitious research impact that will make the world a better place? So I'm going to give you a few minutes just to think about that. Okay, hopefully you've had time to think about how impact's embedded in your research strategy and the practices around that research strategy. If there's any questions on that, please do put them in. But I'm going to start wrapping up. So in doing that, I'm going to bring us back to the title of this webinar: Research Impact, do we all mean the same thing? Now, when we look at generic definitions that exist, my view, and I think if you remember back to David Phipp's definitional dystopia comment, we probably do mean all the same things, because they tend to be written to be very all-encompassing. They tend to be written not to exclude different types of impact. So when we're trying to create something like that, they're rarely different. There may be small tweaks to the words that are used, but essentially they're probably 90 to 95% the same. Be happy to, be challenged on that. If there's a different view in the audience, please put that in the chat. Now, what I do know is different is if I was able to see all of your noun and effect statements, they'd be different for every individual. And that's because research impact is subjective. It's driven by the research objectives we're thinking of at that moment in time, and doing our very best to kind of find information about, solve that issue, move the state of knowledge on in that space. So all of those things, all those biases, all those different things about the research ecosystem, whether it's part of assessment practices, whether it's part of funding calls, whether it's part of your work or the priorities of your university. All of those biases have an impact on what impact we're looking for. And then, of course, as I said, the specific research objectives that you passionately care about as the researcher you are. Okay, so that's fundamentally why specific definitions will always be different. Well, they'll be almost as unique, in fact, probably are as unique as the research objectives that you've written, and we're trying to write research objectives that tend to lead to originality in research. So they tend to be unique. Now, if you want to have impact outside of the academy, no matter what the influences are in your research ecosystem, whether it's like it was in the UK with with that manager, that research leader saying to those colleagues prior to the first ref, don't get involved in that. It won't push your career on. That's a different influence than when we move to impact being incorporated and it being, yeah, we really want you to do this now as part of our institutional strategy because there's money attached to that, quite prosaically. But whatever are the influences, and whether they're influences to take you away from having that research impact or taking you towards that research impact, it ultimately matters what your intrinsic values are. What are your motivations that led you to prioritize that kind of impact from that kind of research? And then you need to build that into your research practice. And hopefully I've given you some ideas of the ways that you can maybe do that. Okay, thank you everybody for attending today. I hope you've found it useful.